This is a picture that was taken a few years ago with me and my friend Isaac Asimov and his wife and now widow, Dr. Janet Jepson. Isaac was my pal for 40 years. We liked each other a lot. I was going to read you maybe. I thought, I got a couple of letters from him talking about how much he likes my stories and telling me, don't argue with people, don't fight with people. I said, yeah, I'm a great one to tell that to. Isaac died last April. Isaac Asimov was one of the really great men of our time. And this may seem a strange time to do an obituary for him almost a year later, but in fact, not a day should go by that you don't hear the name Isaac Asimov, because he was very important to all of us. And I wrote an homage to him, an obituary to him that I'm not going to read you in its entirety because I break up, and that's not very becoming on television. But since the Sci-Fi Channel, when it began, dedicated the channel to him, I thought I would read you this little bit that I had in the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, and it would help us to remember Isaac. Isaac was as much a part of this magazine through the years as paper and ink, and though gone, he remains with us. As he remains with the uncounted thousands of young people who read his essays and stories and went into careers of scientific inquiry, who understood the physical universe because he made it graspable, who became better able to handle their lives because he refused to allow them to accept dogma and bigotry and mendacity in place of common sense and logic. For all of those among you who will mourn him in your own way, the most I have to offer, having been chosen to say goodbye to Isaac in this special venue that he called home for so long, is this one last anecdote of how he viewed himself in his imminent passage. Janet was with him at the end, of course, and his daughter Robin. Janet told me the day before he died that toward the end Isaac had trouble speaking. He could only manage a word or two, and from time to time, then he would say, "I love you," to Janet, and he would smile. But every once in a while, he would murmur, "I want," and he never finished the sentence, just, "I want." And Janet would try to perceive what he needed, and she would say, "A drink of water, Isaac, or something to eat?" And Isaac would look dismayed, annoyed, chagrined that he couldn't put the sentence together, this great thinking machine that at the end could not put a sentence together. And after a moment, he'd let it slide, and he'd forget that he had even spoken, until the last came on the Sunday before he went back into the hospital for the last visit, when he managed to say very clearly, I want Isaac Asimov." And Janet told him he was Isaac Asimov, that he had always been Isaac Asimov, but he looked troubled, because that wasn't what he meant. And then Janet remembered that Isaac had told her some time ago, before he began to slip into abstraction and silence, that if there ever came a time when he didn't know who he was, if there came a time when his mind was not sharp, that he wanted to be let go to sleep quietly, that extraordinary measures should not be taken. And Janet understood that he was saying that he wanted to be Isaac Asimov again. He wanted to be what he was. He wanted to be Isaac Asimov. Then, in that final week before 2:30 a.m. New York time on Monday, April 6th, he was holding Janet's hand, and he looked up at her and he said, very clearly, the last he would ever say, he said, "I am Isaac Asimov." Yes, he was. Yes, indeed he was. I to shoot all day and to pray all night. I worship Kura, she's the Lamb of God. CBS calls him a drunken sod, but I'm a Branch Davidian and I'm okay. I shoot all night and I pray all day. Look, here I stand on, what is that, I don't know, the 490th day of the standoff in Waco, Texas, and the FBI is saying they're going to deal with him as soon as they get a message from God. I can just see God now. God hasn't got anything better to do. He hasn't talked to Jerry Falwell in weeks. Jerry's got bad breath. So God goes, "Come on out, David. It's time, David." Nothing happens. I'm talking to a friend of mine the other day, Tom Monteleone, the author, who happens to write these thrillers about sort of millennial, biblical, supernatural horror novels. Like, well, here, this is one right here. It's called The Blood of the Lamb. Now, this is not The Silence of the Lambs. That's a different one in which people eat people. This one is The Blood of the Lamb, and it's Tom Monteleone. He's a very fine writer. And he writes these books about the Second Coming and that kind of thing. And we're talking about the Branch Davidians and these nutcases who are, sort of pseudo Jim Jones nutcases in Waco, Texas. And he said, how can they be so crazy? How can they believe that stuff? I said, you're a Catholic, Tom. You believe that they nailed up a Jew and he got down off it and he came out of a cave and he walked on water and he raised the dead. What are you telling me that they're crazy for? Well, folks, I've been too easy with you. I've allowed you to believe a lot of very strange things. I really have to intercede in the name of common sense. Now, for instance, the magazine comes out every quarter called A Skeptical Inquirer. It's a very good magazine for you to read. Skeptical Inquirer does articles about those stupid circles that they find in wheat fields in England, which, you know, are made by people doing stupid things in wheat fields. I mean, I guess they have nothing better to do. They have time on their hands. And right here, there's a special report. This special report says 3.7 million Americans have been kidnapped by aliens. They took the reports from all of the various tabloid papers, and they analyzed them. They got a whole mathematical grouping, and they find that if, in fact, as many people as say have been kidnapped by aliens have been, it's 3.7 million Americans. Now, isn't it amazing that of all those 3.7 million Americans, not one of them could put a sentence together properly and grammatically? They always come to some yo-yo out in East Chittenden Switch, Georgia, and then they take him up into space and they give him a rectal examination. Now, I don't know about you, but if I were a proctologist, one rectal examination is more than enough to learn everything you need to know about the human anatomy. But these aliens are either perverts or it's not happening. Look, when I do these comments with you, and being a writer who writes science fiction and fantasy and that kind of thing, I try to tell you that there's a big difference between me using a Loch Ness Monster or a Yeti in a story and actually believing that crap. I don't believe that stuff. I'm a human being. I'm a normal person. I believe in Occam's razor. I think there probably is something out there in space, and eventually we'll find it, but I do not think they come here on a regular weekly basis. Here are the 10 great unanswered questions of science. And not one of them is about flying saucers. Now pay close attention. If you can answer any of these 10, we promise you an all-expense-paid tour to the fabulous Art Deco studios of Sci-Fi Buzz. You'll love it. It's fabulous. It's the size of the Taj Mahal. The 10 great unanswered questions of science from Discover Magazine, November 1992. Number 1, how big is the universe? 2, does chaos rule the cosmos? Number 3, what drives climate? Number 4, how did life start? 5, is anyone out there? 6, how does a single cell become a whole body? 7, what is consciousness? 8, who peopled the planet? 9, how many people can Earth hold? And 10, can we wipe out disease? Now, these are great mysteries. You don't really need to believe crazy stuff, like James Dean is not actually dead, but living hideously deformed in a mental institution in Indiana, or that Elvis Presley makes regular visits to 7-Elevens. You don't have to believe that stuff. Trust me on this. I talk to God regularly. She tells me that's wrong. I read the second, ethics, ethnology, ethnocentricity. Now, get this. The dictionary says ethnocentrism is a belief in the superiority of one's own ethnic group. And this is good, under xenophobia, be with you in a moment here, xenophobe is a person unduly fearful or contemptuous of strangers or foreigners, especially as reflected in his political or cultural views. Now, I know there may be a few of you out there saying, why is this idiot reading to me from the dictionary? That's because I want you to understand the nature of what it is I'm going to say to you, because I'm going to use the words xenophobia and ethnocentrism. And I'm going to use them in reference to American publishers, particularly American publishers of science fiction, who publish mostly American science fiction writers. Occasionally they publish British science fiction writers, but basically they publish Americans. And they have an absolute aversion to translating from other languages the famous and the eloquent and the excellent writers who write science fiction and many other things into English so that you can read them. They would much prefer to sell you endless Star Trek novels, endless trilogies about furry, fuzzy creatures on mythical quests for rings or swords or rectal suppositories or whatever it is those fuzzy little things are always going for. But they won't bother to translate for you the writings of some famous writers in Japan or in France or in Sweden. I mean, even Australia is as alien to them as the dark side of the moon. Now, I have a small list here, and I brought it with me so that I could read you some names, so that if you happen to see any of these people's names, you'll look them up. because American publishers are too busy publishing trash to really take any chances. It's a market-driven genre, and they want more stories that have fantasy trilogy material, and they don't really want to go for anything dangerous. I would recommend to you, for instance, the great Swedish fantasist Sven-Christer Svan. In Sweden, there's also the work of Bertil Martinsen. There are two great fantasists who work you don't even know because they don't bother to translate them into English. In Argentina, Luisa Valenzuela, although she has been translated into English, you can reach her and you can find her stuff if you want. In Japan, if you haven't read the work of Kobo Abe, work like The Boxman and Inner Ice Age 4, you just haven't read. And in Australia, there are people like Terry Dowling and Lucy Sussex, Sean McMullen, Peter Carey, Russell Blackford, Greg Egan, Leanne Fromm. These are just a few of the names that you're not getting because of the ethnocentricity of American publishers. And when they award the Nobel Prize, and they give it to some writer you've never heard of from Zamboanga or New Zealand, you say, who the hell ever heard of him? Well, the rest of the world has heard of him, or her, but you haven't, because you're being denied all of these great works, because all they want is to give you jello. They want to give you mush. You got to resist that. You got to say, I don't want any more mush. No more dopey trilogies about fuzzy-footed creatures.
Hello there. You know, in the old days when science fiction was a bastard genre and people were not allowed to read it out in public, I mean, you could read porn magazines out in public, but you couldn't read science fiction magazines. People would read them inside a copy of the National Geographic. One of the dodges that they used to make it seem as if science fiction was really worthwhile was that it predicted the future. Yes, we predict the future. Why, Jules Verne predicted the submarine. Why, H.G. Wells predicted the time machine. Well, that, of course, was nonsense. Science fiction no more predicts the future than you do. But with hundreds of writers writing at all times and predicting every damn thing there was to predict, eventually they would hit a few things right. It's amazing the things they never did hit right. Even Bob Heinlein, Robert Heinlein, the great seer of the future, never understood that it would be the government that would be sending rockets to the moon. He always thought it was going to be private industry. Well, it wasn't. It was always the government. That is until now. I hold in my hands a press release. This is called a press release. I have scraped it very diligently so that the horse manure and cow flop that's on it usually is not here, and I'm able to hold it without doing myself any great damage. This is a press release from Columbia Pictures. NASA and a consortium of corporations sponsoring the first commercial space mission in U.S. history have chosen Columbia Pictures and its action-adventure fantasy film, The Last Action Hero, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger, to be the first advertiser in space. On the main fuselage of the rocket, there will be an advertisement for The Last Action Hero. I really hate giving them any promotion like this. And on the payload, which will orbit the Earth for a minimum of 2 years, conducting microgravity experiments, this moron ad for this dopey movie will be circling the Earth. Can't you say, honey, let's go out tonight with the telescope and take a look at Arnold's ad again? Well, the president of Space Marketing, Inc., do you love that? Space Marketing, Inc., it's worthy of Frederick Pohl and C.M. Kornblum, said, after reviewing many possible promotional partners for this historical event, Columbia Pictures was chosen for their ingenious creativity that represents the same goals as the American space program. I didn't realize that the American space program's goal was to make money for Columbia Pictures and dopey action-adventure movies and make Arnold Schwarzenegger even more money. I don't know why it bothers me. I mean, it's basically a pretty stupid thing, this press release. I suppose it's because here we are down here on this mud ball, looking up at the stars, maybe the last 40, 50 years, actually thinking we're going to reach them someday and hoping that we're a noble enough species to do it. And when we get the chance, we turn it into the same kind of cheap, sleazy advertising medium as everything else on the planet. Boy, does that make me unhappy. Does that make you unhappy?